At 3:03 a.m., Brandon Swanson was still on the phone with his dad. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't panicking. He was walking and talking like a normal person, describing fences in the dark and lights in the distance like he was minutes away from safety. Then his voice snapped. Two words, sharp and immediate. "Oh, shh!" And that was it. No scream, no splash, no struggle, just a dead, open silence on the line, as if the world around him swallowed sound itself. His father kept calling his name louder and louder, listening for anything, breathing, footsteps, wind, something to prove his son was still there. Nothing. Brandon Swanson vanished in the middle of a conversation, and what makes this case so disturbing is how ordinary it begins, and how completely it refuses to end with an explanation. Brandon was 19, a smart kid from Marshall, Minnesota, the kind of place where the horizon is wide, the roads run straight, and the nights can feel endless if you're out past midnight. He was in college, he had plans, and by May of 2008 his first year had wrapped up. Like a lot of students, he went out to celebrate. It wasn't anything dramatic, just parties, friends, small towns scattered across farm country. People who saw him that night said he'd had some drinks, but he didn't seem out of control. He didn't seem like someone who was about to disappear from the face of the earth. Close to midnight, Brandon left and started driving back toward home, and if he had taken the obvious route, he likely would have been there quickly. Instead, he ended up on rural back roads, dark grid roads where you can miss a turn and not realize it for miles, where one field looks exactly like the next, and where a pair of distant lights can convince you you're heading the right way even when you're drifting farther from anything familiar. Just before 2 a.m., Brandon called his parents. His voice was tense but not frantic. He told them his car was stuck in a ditch and he couldn't get it out. He said he wasn't hurt, but he needed help, and he tried to explain where he was. The problem was that Brandon was already disoriented. He insisted he was somewhere between Marshall and a small town called Lind, which would have made sense. Except later, it would become clear that he wasn't near Lind at all. His parents didn't know that yet. All they knew was their son was alone on back roads in total darkness, and so they got in the car and drove out immediately, keeping him on the phone the entire time. Brandon tried to help them find him by flashing his headlights, and his parents drove around listening for those flashes through the phone, scanning the roads, expecting any second to see him. But they never did, and the longer it went on, the stranger it became, because Brandon sounded confident that he was close, while his parents were driving circles through the wrong area, chasing a location that existed only in Brandon's head. At some point, frustration set in. The directions weren't working, the night felt bigger by the minute, and Brandon made a decision that may have sealed his fate. He told his father he could see lights in the distance and he was going to start walking toward them. He described the ground under his feet as he moved, talked about fences, and mentioned he could hear water nearby. It's hard to overstate how unsettling that is because it paints a picture of someone moving through open land in pitch-black conditions, guided by little more than faint lights, and the belief that he's almost there. His father stayed on the line, listening to him walk and talk, trying to keep him focused, trying to help him make sense of what he was seeing. And for a while it sounded like it might actually work. Brandon wasn't screaming, he wasn't running, he was just walking, like a person who thinks this is a temporary inconvenience and that in a few minutes he'll be somewhere safe and warm. Then, without warning, the tone of the entire night changed in an instant. Brandon suddenly blurted out, "Oh, shh," like he'd just stepped into something he couldn't take back. like he'd seen the ground disappear, like something jumped out of the dark right in front of him. And immediately after those words, the call went silent. His father called out. No answer. He waited, listened, and called again. Still nothing. He hung up and called back over and over, thinking Brandon might have dropped the phone and couldn't see it, and that the ringing would help him locate it. In some attempts, the phone rang, meaning it was still powered, still connected to a network, still out there, somewhere, in the dark. But Brandon never picked up again, and eventually those calls stopped ringing and began going straight to voicemail. The moment was so abrupt and so clean that it didn't feel like a gradual loss of signal or a normal dropped call. It felt like someone walked through a doorway and the door shut behind them. By morning, Brandon's parents were desperate for help, and the case immediately ran into the kind of bureaucracy that makes tragedies worse. They tried to report him missing, and despite the circumstances, cold night, isolation, the sudden silence, there was initial hesitation, because Brandon was technically an adult. Eventually, law enforcement got involved, and this is where the most brutal twist landed. When investigators looked at phone records, they realized Brandon's location was nowhere near where everyone had been searching. He wasn't between Marshall and Lind. He was miles away, near the area of Taunton and Porter. The entire frantic nighttime search had been aimed at a false map, and Brandon, alone, had been walking in the opposite reality. When they found his car, it was sitting in a ditch far from where his parents expected, making it clear that he had been lost long before he ever said he was lost. Search teams expanded out from the vehicle. Dogs were brought in. The countryside was combed. Rivers and creeks became focal points because of what Brandon had said on the phone, water nearby, and because of what his father believed he heard after those final words, a slip, a fall, something sudden. One of the most haunting details is how the scent trail was interpreted. The idea that Brandon may have reached water and that whatever happened next didn't leave the kind of evidence people expect. Because this wasn't dense forest where you can disappear behind trees. This was open farmland, ditches, gravel roads and waterways. The kind of environment where, eventually, something should surface. Clothing, a phone, a footprint, a sign that a body was moved, anything at all. But nothing meaningful was recovered. No phone, no definitive trace, no final location that closed the circle. That's why theories in this case never feel satisfying, only plausible. One possibility is the simplest. Brandon fell into a river or a flooded ditch in the dark, and the shock of it was those last two words. If he was swept, if he struck his head, if he couldn't climb out, then the silence makes sense and the absence of evidence becomes a cruel extension of the landscape. Another possibility is that he got wet, got out, and hypothermia began doing what it does, turning decisions into mistakes, turning direction into confusion, turning a straight line into wandering. In rural terrain at night, you can walk for hours without realizing you've been moving away from help the entire time. And once exhaustion hits, the body can shut down in places no one thinks to look. There are also the uglier possibilities people can't help but consider. An accident involving a road or farm equipment, a hidden hazard like a culvert or drop-off, or even foul play. Investigators reportedly found no clear evidence pointing to an attack. But the problem is that they also found no clear evidence pointing to anything else. The case is a vacuum, and vacuums invite whatever fears the mind is willing to pour into them. What lingers most isn't the image of a crash or a search. It's the sound of that call, someone alive, talking, moving, and then suddenly reacting to something unseen before disappearing into silence. Brandon Swanson didn't vanish in a locked room. He vanished in open country, under a night sky, while his father listened. And maybe that's what makes this story feel like a warning, that you can be close enough to call home, close enough to describe what you see, close enough to believe you're almost safe, and still be one step away from a moment you never return from. If you had been on that line with him, if you had heard those last words in real time, what would you think happened in the darkness right after he said them?